So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So we have some new members here today. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. We start out with a great train drive-by, so that's a fantastic way to start. So this week, we're going to talk about generosity, charity, and the concept of altruism. This conversation came up a week ago. I was having a conversation with Liz Swain, who leads the Downtown Development Authority in Shreveport. And she came out and volunteered with us as we were working to spruce up Scyport. And we had a great conversation about the importance of community investment. The idea that we own the community we live in, right? So Scyport, while it belongs to the city and it's run as a children's museum, is a resource for the community. It's something that brings value to the community. And while we pay taxes that, help provide for it, and the admissions help provide for the maintenance fees and whatnot here, it's our resource. It's something that we should value. And that, for instance, is why we volunteer here, right? We help them just do little things, the little bit of maintenance capability that we have, we help provide to them so that they can defer those costs onto something else that they need to fund. And that idea that we should be investing our time and our resources into our community, to me, simply makes sense. This is where we live, and the better we make it, the more prosperous it can become, both in the financial sense and then also in the cultural and community sense. So I wanted to explore this topic a little bit and why those concepts are important in being human, and how they contribute to our communities and to the greater bit of humanity. So what does generosity mean? When people say, oh, I was feeling very generous today, or oh, that person was very, not generous with whatever it was, resources. I think a lot of us kind of put that with the concept of charity, right? That we gave usually money specifically to something, that we were generous with our money or whatever. And a lot of times it focuses on what is visible, and that's oftentimes panhandlers and or homeless people. And so I did a little bit of research on panhandling and homelessness, and there's some research that says from the National Institute of Health that panhandlers and homeless people are not necessarily the same group of people. They said there's only a small percentage of overlap between those two. And also that panhandlers are not interested in regular employment because a lot of what they would be accessible to them is minimum wage, which is scarcely more financially beneficial to them than actually panhandling. And so I find that really interesting because we think about, oh, I was very generous today. I gave $5 to the person on the side of the road, and that might be useful to them. But it might just be that it made you feel good and really isn't beneficial or advantageous to your community. Because what it might be that's most advantageous to them is for you to be generous with your time or generous with your understanding of their situation. One of the things that they talked about in why they panhandle is that they're dealing with either mental illness, which is only a portion of them, it's not all of them, with disability, with trauma from experiences in their life, and with just a general disconnection from the community. And so if we can provide that, or provide the resources to address any one or a number of those issues, then we may have an opportunity to bring someone back into the community who currently exists outside of it. So I think that's an important thing to do, is to challenge even our definition of the word generous or generosity to include both time and understanding. So I'll do the standard academic starting when it comes to defining your words, right? So generosity, and this is one I thought was interesting. This is how they explain it on the, basically people who are learning English as a second language. These were the definitions they gave, and I thought it was one of the better ones. Generosity is the quality of being kind, understanding, and not selfish. And then sort of the standard definition from Merriam-Webster was characterized by a noble or kindly spirit and magnanimous or kindly. So it's not being giving. It's not that you give stuff. It's that you're understanding. and you're kind. I think that's a really good way to think about being generous. One of the things that I've been exposed to over the years is generosity, particularly when it comes to our relationships. So go on a slight tangent and then bring it back. A lot of times it's difficult for us to be generous with our understanding. When somebody does something, we often assume the worst of them. You know, when we think about people on the road, right? Somebody cuts us off. We automatically think, oh, well, that idiot cut me off on purpose. When oftentimes they just don't see that we're there, right? They're just not paying attention. But it's hard because we want to attribute blame. So it's a thing called fundamental attribution error, where we're assigning intent where there might not be any. And so I think it's important for us, for the driver on the road, because they could be rushing to an emergency, they could be going through a crisis, there could be any number of things. Now, they could just be on their phone and not paying attention. That's fair, right? That's a lot of people. But still, I think we should be generous with them because we would want other people to be generous to us. Happens to me. I get on the highway and I merge and I don't see a car. They're in my blind spot and I don't check it well enough. I'm not trying to cut somebody off. It just happens. And so if we're generous about it, everybody relaxes, we get on with our day and everything's fine. I think this is really important in relationships too. A lot of times after you've been together for a while, I think we lose sight of the fact that we chose to be together, right? And so let's say that one partner forgets to do something the other partner asked them to do. Now, did they specifically ignore doing that thing just to spite the other one? Or did they probably just forget about it? Or maybe just have a different set of priorities? Being generous in our thought, to me, is one of the great ways that we can start at the individual level to kind of train ourselves to be generous and understanding of others. Now, with that idea, we bring it back to kind of the greater community concept of being generous and say, okay, let's hope that I've trained myself to be generous enough in my individual circumstances, and let's go back into the community. What does my community need that I can contribute? How can I be generous with myself, whether my time, my understanding, my volunteer efforts, or maybe my money when it comes to charity? And I think if we do that and we open ourselves up a little bit to be generous and outside of our own little individual circle, I think we'll realize that there is something for us to contribute and that it is good and useful to do, but not in the short term. And that's I think one of the tough pieces. So one thing I want to talk about in terms of generosity as well is part of the definition mentioned magnanimous. To be open-hearted, to be understanding. So magnanimity is a virtue that was promoted by Aristotle. So he had his virtues, which were balances between two vices. And I've always thought, while the virtues themselves, you could argue, could be categorized differently or chosen differently, I like the concept of balance in choosing things which are good in the world. So generosity is neither giving everything you have to your own detriment, nor is it being stingy, also kind of to your detriment because you are hostile and not understanding of the world around you. I think it makes you a bitter and closed-off person. So the balance, the virtue in between those two things is generosity or magnanimity. The balance of giving of yourself, and I think you really do receive something in the long term in terms of the health of your community. So when it comes to being generous and trying to reprogram yourself to be generous in your community and let go of the individual piece of it, instead of attributing intent or malice to whether it's leaders in the city who may not be spending things as you think would be appropriate, or people on the road cutting you off, or whatever it is, don't ask, oh, what's wrong with that idiot? Ask, what might be going on that I don't know about? And I think if we can do that, we can help to reorient ourselves to be a little bit more generous with our thought. And that gets us to charity. So charity, and I like the first definition I found, which was generosity and helpfulness, especially toward the needy or the suffering. Benevolent goodwill toward or love of humanity, which I thought was fantastic because I think aligns really well with what we do. And then, of course, there's the gift, right? The last definition for charity, though, is lenient judgment of others, to be charitable. Means this kind of the same thing as generosity, is to be forgiving and to be open to understanding their circumstances. So that one, I just wanted to compare sort of to generosity. I think they're tied together. And it's not related just to money or stuff. I think we have become very focused on the money and the stuff piece of generosity and charity. But I think we can get away from that and figure out how we can contribute as opposed to what we can contribute. So what are the consequences of charity? I think a lot of people have this idea that, and in circumstances I think they're right, that if we give people things, they will become dependent on those things. And maybe not individuals specifically. Maybe they will transition over time and get out on their own and be able to take care of themselves. But I think we then establish processes where people become dependent on things being given. So that's one aspect of charity that might be a downside. And not to say that it's good or bad, but I think we should consider both. Another consequence of charity could be a form of social insurance. So decades ago, the primary caretaker of the needy, the sick, the mentally ill were churches. They provided for the majority of charity for people that did not have a social structure or a network to care for them. And so then after the coming about of the Great Deal and the social networks and Social Security and Medicare and provisions for those who are in need, I think as individuals, we have lost sight of the fact that it is the society's responsibility to care for those around us. And not simply because it's some inherent metaphysical good that can be defined in all cases, but because that actually makes sense for the stability of society. When people don't have resources to care for themselves, and particularly to care for their children, they're going to do whatever they need to do to survive. I know that if I were in a circumstance where my children were at risk of harm or hunger or dying, I would steal and cheat and do whatever it took to get them fed. No questions asked. Because when you think about it as a human, our prime directive is to protect our life and to pass on our genes from the biological sense, right? That's why we have the capacity for violence and for all of these different things, because at times they may be necessary. And so I think we have to really account for that. If we want to live in a society that is peaceful and we don't have to worry about those things, we have to provide for those around us. Rising inequality will, I think, eventually get to the point where we end up back at the French Revolution, where you got a lot of guillotines going on. And if we can prevent that by providing for people, providing them a sense and a pursuit of meaning, and at least the resources to live a life outside of hunger, I think that's really important. So social insurance then is one of the side effects of charity and generosity. And then I think a little bit along the lines of the last point, kind of a unity of tribe and a willingness to have that understanding in the circumstances of others. If we are engaged in charity and generosity, in the conceptual sense, not the giving of stuff sense, I think we become more connected with those who we may otherwise not understand. Those of us who come from families that were able to provide for us may not understand how someone could end up in the circumstances where they have nothing, or they're begging for money on the street. And it may seem, and oftentimes we get into the realm of fundamental attribution error, where we say, well, there must be something wrong with them that they got into that circumstance. When oftentimes structural circumstances drove them to where they are, and if we took a moment to understand it, I think we would be a little bit more generous. And there's definitely a point of charity where there is a short-term loss for potentially a long-term gain. You are giving of your resources, of your time, which is valuable, to something which you do not get from which you do not get an immediate return. All right, so Eric and Katie and I spent our morning here sprucing up the old gift shop so that Cyport can have a new tenant that can hopefully bring in more business and support the museum as a whole. We didn't get anything for that. It made us feel good, I guess, a little bit in the short term. But there's no pay, there's nothing, no good deal out of it. But we believe in the mission of the organization to educate children for the future. Education, of course, is a foundational piece of stability and progress for a society, and particularly for a local community. So in the long-term sense, maybe after we're all gone, it will have an impact. But I think it's only because our human brain, the frontal cortex that can see the long-term risks and rewards, can envision that future and we can focus on it, that we can overcome the short-term thinking of the primitive human brain that says, I hoard my resources for me and my family. So I think that's one of the outcomes of charity that we do have to consider and really hold in our mind. And then that gets to the concept of altruism. I've heard it defined a lot of different ways. There are a couple here, and then I'm going to pose a question that I don't think has an entirely clear answer. I'll give my thoughts on it. So definitions are this: unselfish regard for, devotion to the welfare of others, or behavior by an animal that is not beneficial to or may be harmful to itself, but that benefits others of its species. Those are two definitions. And I think when you look at those two together, I think you can bring those into a harmony that makes it a useful concept for us. So alternative heard altruism defined as purely selfless acts. I personally can't envision a world in which an act is purely selfless. Right? So people who aim for pure altruism and give everything, give all of their resources away, give all of their time away until they basically cease to exist or they die of deprivation, to me seems more like mental illness, honestly, because you could have a greater long-term impact if you at least provided for yourself to continue helping others. Additionally, I think the human mind it seems as though it's programmed to receive at least a psychological good from helping others, right? Generally, we feel good when we help others in society. We're programmed to be social creatures. So I think, at least in that sense, we get at least the feeling of good out of helping others, of being generous and being charitable. But if you look at that second definition there, something that may be harmful to you, or at least you lose in the short term for the long-term gain of your species, I think in that sense we can be altruistic. But it's not purely selfless. It is selfish in the sense that we are continuing humanity, continuing the human story and our connection of meaning into the future. Because humans are conceptually kind of two pieces, right? There's the biological and the evolved piece, and then there's that piece where we haven't quite defined yet of the human mind. So there's the body, the brain, and the mind, right? So the body and brain are one thing, and then the brain and the mind kind of bridge between those, or the brain bridges, and then the mind is this thing that we can think about, right? The whole I think, therefore I am piece. And if we keep reproducing and keep having babies, we're going to go on as long at least as the planet goes, or if we can get off the planet to whatever other resources we have, and that's fine. Most organisms are programmed to do that. But the mind piece is, I think, the piece that we value above anything else. The knowledge, the connection, the thought that we've put together over millennia is the thing that is what it means to be human. And so while we may be gone and die, and maybe even we are forgotten in the longer sense of human history, if we are contributing to an effort that helps continue human meaning, then in a way, we have continued to be part of that existence. And so in that way, it's, I think, impossible to be purely selfless, but possible to be selfless in the short term so that humanity gains in the long term. And so, as we were talking about before we got started today, so Being Human Church is a humanist church. The mission of that human church is to be pro-human, and specifically to pull that human story forward into the future, and ideally into the future infinitely, that we can escape the confines of the resources of the planet, the solar system, possibly even the universe. Who knows what's going to happen in 25,000 to millions of years? That's beyond our worry for today. But it starts with today. It starts with the idea that we have to have a long-term mindset, that we have to be willing to invest in ourselves, in our communities, and the rest of humanity as part of an effort to continue that meaning and that story forward. So I challenge everyone to consider that, to hold that in your mind, that what I do on a given day should be generous, should be charitable toward the idea of the human story. And how can I contribute, even in small ways, in a day to help that story continue to move forward? So volunteering then, which is something I think we should all be doing on a regular basis, is engaging in an activity that benefits one's community without the expectation of immediate compensation. That's okay. That's okay for us to do. We still have to take care of the basics. We've got to take care of ourselves and our families and everyone else. But then we can use our excess time, which realistically in today's society, at least in America, we live in a world of excess and decadence, if you really think about it, from the basic needs of the human. So if we take a little bit of that extra resources, whether it's time, money, compassion, understanding, and apply it to our community, I think we can really move the human story into the future. So thank you all for listening today. I hope this has been an interesting point of reflection for the day as we start the new year. So what we'll do is we'll shut the video down for the day and then talk about what we were grateful for in the week previous, what we're looking forward to in the week to come, and then maybe what opportunities we have to be generous. So thank you and have a great week.